Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. The New York Times calls James McBride's latest a murder mystery inside a great American novel. Charming, smart, heart-blistering, and heart-healing. The Heaven and Earth grocery store starts in 1972 when workers in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, find a skeleton at the bottom of a well. Who the skeleton was and how it got there were just two of the long-held secrets kept by the residents of Chicken Hill, a neighborhood where for decades immigrant Jews and African Americans lived side by side. James McBride is an accomplished musician and author of the National Book Award-winning The Good Lord Bird, the #1 best-selling American classic The Color of Water, and the bestsellers Deacon King Kong, Song Yet Sung, and Miracle at St. Anna. A recipient of the National Humanities Medal in 2016, he's a distinguished writer in residence at New York University. Again, the new novel is The Heaven and Earth grocery store, and it is a great pleasure and honor to speak to James McBride on this week's book show. Thank you very much for being with us. A great pleasure to have you on the program.
I'm glad to be here.
This book and what it tells about Chicken Hill and specifically Pottstown, where did that all start for you?
Well, it started in the life of my mother, my mother was Jewish, and she raised 12 black children in the 50s and 60s, and she was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home, and they had a grocery store in the black section of town of Suffolk, Virginia. So when I was researching that book, I was always intrigued by the life of many of the people that I met while researching that book. I always wanted to visit that again to kind of explore what life was like for Jewish Americans in the earlier part of the 20th century. And also, I was trying to find a way to write about the disabled in a way that was informative and entertaining, and these things kind of came together at the same time as I was putting this book together.
Let's begin with Pottstown. As a kid who grew up in Montgomery County in Pennsylvania, what was it about Pottstown and specifically in Chicken Hill that made it so unique and made it a place where Chicken Hill could exist?
Well, Pottstown really was just well, first of all, it was an accident because I initially wanted to root this thing in Pottsville. But Pottsville is another 2-3 hours away west in Pennsylvania. And I was heading out to Penhurst, which is the old insane asylum. And I saw a sign that said Pottstown. I drove in and I loved it. It's a beautiful town. It looks a lot like it must have looked back then. A lot of the old buildings. And so I started doing some research into the area, and I found out there was an area called Chicken Hill right above the town where the blacks and Jews lived, and immigrants, Italians and Irish and others who couldn't afford to live in the better parts of town. And I said, this is a good place to set the story. So really, Pottstown is any town, USA. Pennsylvania is a really good tableau for the writer in this situation because Pennsylvania had a lot of different types of people. And, once you get outside of Philly, Pennsylvania becomes very much America. Not to say that Philadelphia is not. I mean, Philadelphia is, cradle of America, but it was just a place where you could lay in a story that would be as pertinent in, Houston or Albany as anywhere else, because you had blacks and Jews, poor people living together and their interactions, which create the kind of ignition for a good story.
Like your grandmother, the main character in the book one of the main characters runs a grocery store in this neighborhood, and this is the Heaven and Earth grocery store, which in and of itself is different, right? It is because it has that duality of serving both the Jewish and black populations.
Well, that store is run by a very eccentric woman named Hona Ludlow, she's just an exuberant person who doesn't mind losing money. She loves her neighborhood. She loves her neighbors. She's just a really interesting character from that period. And so her sort of courage and her love of life and love of people is what powers the book, at least in the early chapters.
we get to the point where you introduce a character, Dodo. Tell us a little bit about Dodo, and you mentioned Penhurst, but how ultimately Dodo comes into the picture, and how things change as a result of his appearance.
Well, I initially wanted to write a book about the disabled because I worked in a camp not too far from where you were, called Variety Club Camp for Handicapped Children. I worked there for 4 summers, and I was very inspired by the man who ran it, whose name was Cy Friend. And we learned more about life from those children than what we could have ever taught them. I wanted a place where I could show people what I learned, because the truth is, when you work with the disabled, well, first of all, like, disabled people are like witnesses to their own lynching. Everybody gets to make a speech about them but them, you know. And
Mm.
which, when you work with disabled children, and also I had a niece who was very disabled who died at age 28. You start to see that they don't waste time with a lot of the nonsense that you and I might waste time on. They know what's important, and they've been witnesses all their lives. People have talked over their heads their entire lives, but yet they have 1,000 things and thoughts inside that never get expressed. And so I wanted to just show what their world was like. And so that's what Dodo is. He's a 12-year-old boy who's deaf, and he makes friends with another kid named Monkey Pants. And their friendship, powers a good part of the narrative in the middle of the book.
It is such a striking and beautiful part of the book where these two characters really come up with their own language. They come up with a way to communicate with one another. They become friends, and they are people who have been left and haven't had that chance to communicate, and then a friendship develops. It's really beautiful to read about that. Did that come from you seeing that play out at your time working in a camp?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, this was in the 70s. I mean, if the man who ran that camp was a special person, but if he did they would arrest him now for allowing him to do because he was so, we took the kids on hikes on highways, hikes in the woods. We had kids in wheelchairs being pushed by other kids who were, who had cerebral palsy. And I mean, a lot of their care came from other kids because, kids just manage. They learn quickly to manage if they have to. And they were having so much fun. It just, what I really learned was that I really don't know what normal is. When you work with disabled children, you quickly learn that your idea of normal may not be what you think it is.
James McBride is our guest. The name of the new novel is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. It is published by Riverhead Books. These are characters that ultimately are good people who are trying really hard to just get through life in the best way they can. And with that, and with the great humor that you write with, it just seems like you don't have a lot of room for the grimmer aspects of our life.
Well, I mean, I don't know. The sum of your life is what you pay attention to. And so I've always felt that my job as a writer is to try to interpret the world at least a little bit. And happiness and humor is one way of interpreting the world. And I suppose I was just born with that. My family's very funny. We always joke. We joke about painful things, and you can't go through life just thinking everyone's evil and that you have to be afraid of people. You're not going to make it. You won't have fun. So I can't write the kinds of books that are doom and gloom, or take your medicine, or you know all white people this way, all black people that way. I just can't. Life is too complicated and really too precious to waste time with that kind of business.
And this isn't, of course, just for about blacks and Jews, but other groups as well that have that humanity and humility and happiness and are just filled with that to get through life.
Well, that's what Chicken Hill was. Chicken Hill was a community where people who just, Italians, Irish, Presbyterians. Everybody who lived there basically had to get along because it wasn't like there wasn't much, and you dealt with what you had, and you dealt with the cards that you received. Now, I don't want to sound like, this is the good old days, and
Right.
the everything was good, everything was great. It was not. It was not great. But you worked to make life decent, and most people who were there had lived much more difficult lives before they arrived there, and so they just worked all the way to the end to find some decency and happiness. And that's a good thing to aim for, as long as it's not at the expense of the next person.
As you said, I mean, it's not all a rosy picture, but I mean, you certainly look at the plights of small town life as well as just how vibrant a small town, especially like Chicken Hill, can be.
Well, I mean, I enjoyed spending time there as a writer because I thought the people were funny and, they did stupid and interesting things. And the sense of community is what bonded these people, and it's what bonds people in general. And then listen, during that time, it's not like you can get on the phone and call up and have groceries delivered or have someone, you know, drop a box of Rice Krispies at your house. I mean, you had to you had to go out, you had to shop, you had to get along with people, you had to go get water, you had to make amends if you made a mistake. But there was always room to say, "I'm sorry, I made a mistake." And I think that's what made that time a little bit different than now. Today, you can hide behind something and go home and just go to the internet and just start spewing all kinds of nonsense, and people will listen to you. Well,
Mm.
some people, anyway.
You look at this place and people that are working together, and there's just that sense of how lovely local is, right? That there's a community that's working together and sort of is for, I think, mostly good in the case of this novel, unplugged from the outside world and all of the hate that's going on outside of that.
Well, they're all centered around Dodo and his, the state of Pennsylvania trying to take him from the neighborhood, and that a lot of heat falls on the neighborhood and this little grocery store and the woman who runs it as a result of Dodo's situation. So it gives everyone a common wall to push against, and so their differences are discarded as they try to keep this boy amongst them. Sometimes stories roll out that way. It hadn't I hadn't intended to move in that direction, but it rolled out in that way, which gave me a lot of room to find common ground for the characters who are different and who do lead different lives, to find a road that they can walk down together.
You're ultimately in examining a life of this amazing woman who runs this grocery store, who is based on your grandmother, who your mother has told you stories about. You give her a challenging life, but a good life.
Well, my in real life, my grandmother had a very difficult life. She was in a marriage where she really wasn't loved. So I put her on the page and I made her loved.
Yeah.
And so, it helps me and it helps people see what the possibilities are. Because if she were alive, she'd certainly be, if she were living in this time, she would have had a much easier life. She spoke Yiddish, she had polio, she lived in a small town in the South, her husband didn't love her. She had a very difficult time of it.
I love how you tell this story too, because she's very loved by her husband, and yet her husband tries to get her to move out, to do other things, to not run the grocery store. And yet she persists, and while there may be some eye rolling, he knows that it's best and what she wants because of that love.
Well, yeah, I mean, this book didn't really come to life until Shona arrived. I mean, in other words, when I started writing the book, it just begins with the theater owner, Moshe. She makes an early appearance in the book, and as soon as she arrived as a character, the book started to just flow out. And it's because they loved each other and they had a real marriage. And sometimes that happens in books. I mean, in a real way.
Hmm.
Of course, you can always, put two characters in a room and have them take their clothes off and see what happens, but that doesn't really help the book. But in this case, she just became. I mean, listen, even though my grandmother was like the seed of this character, once Shona really started to evolve, she became, in my imagination, just a vibrant, just a force, you know. And her husband couldn't do anything. He couldn't contain her, and that was part of her power, both as a woman and as a Jew, and as just a dynamic force in a community that was not considered the best place to live in the town of Pottstown.
James McBride is our guest. The name of the new novel is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. Many themes that you have looked at in previous work. For you, what was different in the writing of this novel?
Well, I think the research in this novel took many more years than my previous books. Deacon King Kong was relatively easy research wise because I still work in my church every week in New York, even though Deacon King Kong takes place in '69. But the Good Lord Bird took, which is about John Brown, the abolitionist, that was a lot of travel, a lot of research. But this book, I started researching it back in 2008 because I was researching mental institutions, and it just took a longer time to hatch because it has a lot more disparate elements. It's about whites and blacks and Jews. It's about a town that I never lived in, about a state that I really don't know that well, and so there was a lot more research, and really the research on this was exhausting. Writing the book was not hard, but the research was was quite extensive.
Give us a sense of what you were researching, of what obviously you had the experience from the facility you worked at. The facility you write about is much different, of course. But what was it that you wanted to get to research to get right?
Well, I mean, mental institutions in the 30s and 40s and how they treated children. Mental institutions are notorious, and I don't want to belabor your listeners with, some of the most dreadful elements of that flawed institution. But that required going into, like, for example, I spent a lot of time at Norristown State Hospital outside of Philly because it
Yeah,
still exists.
yeah.
I walked the grounds. I learned everything there is to know. But even though you only use 10% of what you learn, you have to know it all. So I learned everything that I could during those months of study about it. Because when you're talking about disabled children during that period, when they were sent somewhere, they weren't sent to camp. They were sent to institutions, which was in a way of kind of a way of killing them, basically. I mean, not in a real, but they didn't belong there. So that took a long time, and then I had to research elements of Jewish life in the 30s and 40s, in the 20s, because I didn't know that much about it. I knew what my mother spoke about, and people when I researched my first book, but that was 35 years ago. So I had to go and figure out what elements of Jewish life were relevant, and how Yiddish played in, and how music and culture were part of Jewish life, and how what to use, what not, what to keep, what to leave behind. It was involved. Similarly for the black characters, the ones that came from South Carolina, as opposed to the ones who were born and raised in Pennsylvania. Uh, Pennsylvania history of this town, history of other Pennsylvania towns. It was a lot of work, and you don't use most of it, but you have to know it.
I was struck. You were just mentioned Norristown State Hospital, which I'm very familiar with, and was just a stone's throw away from. But I mean, that used to be called the State Lunatic Hospital of Norristown, which gives you a sense of how just our language has changed in regards to the disabled and the mentally ill. What sense did you get in that research of, for want of a better term, the system that we have and where that succeeds and where it tragically fails?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert in these things by any means. When I was at Norristown State Hospital, I thought the people there were very, very good about caring for the mentally ill that were there. But the mentally ill that were there, that hospital wasn't operating at full capacity at that time. This is going back some years now. This was
Yeah.
in 2008, 2009. I mean, I felt that the the, the mental hospital model obviously had outlived its usefulness, if it was ever useful at all. And so I'm sure there are people, including many of your listeners, who have clear ideas about how this is supposed to work. But even those who were at the hospital were pretty clear that what used to happen there shouldn't have happened. So, my sense of it is that we still have not developed. I mean, this again, based on my knowledge of it at the time, that we still haven't developed quite the model that we need for the disabled and mentally ill people in this country. And you know, as a New Yorker, I can tell you we haven't worked it out very well at all in New York City. You can tell a lot about a country by how it treats its children, its old people, its schools, and its disabled. And on none of those are we really a shining light these days. And that pings into some other societal problems that I'm not qualified to discuss. But I think we're better off now than we were in terms of how we deal with the disabled. But again, I'm not disabled in the sense that I don't have a physical challenge that makes climbing the stairs or going to the movies a difficulty for me or a challenge for me.
When you were spending time at the state hospital, what were you observing? What were you curious about?
Life. What's a day in this place like? Uh, in the 30s and 40s, most people spent the entire day in a day room, you know, and they would just stay there all day. Well, when you see a day room, it's hard to imagine why a person wouldn't go crazy in a place like that.
Right.
When you're going out to research a book or a story of any type, you have to remember I was a journalist for a long time. You're looking for the details that tell the story. And a lot of times the details are just in the window panes and the brick and mortar of the room, the smell of the place, the way the halls look, the way the halls might have looked back then, an old dentist chair that's just been discarded in the corner, a room that's no longer being used, a burial ground, the old farming places where they farmed and made the vegetable, grew the food for the patients, a wheelchair. It's hard to say. You're just there asking questions and getting the spirit of the place so that when you recreate it, it's somewhat accurate.
And a lot of people don't just trust in the novel. They don't know and can't figure out Dodo, and yet left to his own devices figures things out. And without spoiling it, I mean, the ending you give for this character is just perfect because it's happiness is what it is, right? And this seems like just such a real way for this character to have ended up.
Well, evolution,
Right.
is important, and you don't want to write a book that's going to make people sad. You want to give the reader a chance to, you want to have them go from one page to the next for better reasons, not than just, I hope this guy gets killed reasons, or I hope she jumps out a window reason, or she should leave him reason. That's not a good reason to write a book, at least not for me.
Well, I was going to say not for you, but it is rare. I mean, it is rare to read a novel where there is as much hope in the final pages and in the epilogue as there is in this volume.
Well, I mean, look, first of all, I don't read a lot of other novels because I don't want to know what everybody else is doing.
Yep.
But the other thing is that the novels that I do read give me hope in some form or fashion. Even Moby Dick, which ends with the ship, sinking, and you come away from that with an appreciation for the sea and for whales and for whalemen and their wives and people who love these men. You come away with appreciation for life and of course appreciation for the character, the young man who takes us through this world, and you appreciate the writer for introducing us to this guy, this Ishmael, who takes us to a world that's almost magical. And at some point that this really happened somewhere in some form. And so you close the book thankful. You're not might not feel happy, but you're thankful that the writer educated you in a way that illuminated your heart and soul. That's what I suppose I'm aiming for.
So that's the experience that you got in reading Moby Dick as a reader. When you finished Heaven and Earth Grocery Store, what was the sense you had as the writer?
My sense is that the publisher has to pay me now. That's my sense. That was my
Well,
sense.
I assume the
But no,
check
no.
I assume the check cleared, right? Is that okay?
Yes, sir, it did. Thank you very
Excellent.
much. Amen. Dominus on me crossing myself. No. Look, the end are two of the most beautiful words in the English language, really. So,
Yes.
but I mean, when you finish the manuscript, you go through it, you go through it many different times before you even hand it in. But, when I finished the first draft, I was very happy. And at one point, I was really moved by the events. And I wrote the book. I still was moved by them. So then I knew it was good. I said, this is okay, because I don't hand in a book that's halfway done. I hand it in. It's usually pretty clean when I'm done with it, because I rewrite it, many times. I fix it up all the way until it's ready.
Was the ending that is so beautiful and makes so many connections, did that take longer? Was that a longer part of the cake to bake?
No, no, no. The ending was easy. Really, the most difficult part of the book was the middle part. The middle section of a book is always difficult for
Right.
me, because the reader's like, now is the reader engaged or not? Even if they're engaged, they haven't read the book in one sitting. They have to pick it up. They have to figure out where they are. Sort of like when you see a good sitcom or something on television, which I don't have a television. When I used to watch, I was told that you can watch 5 minutes of it and then you kind of know what's going on. The middle section of this book, I think there are 3 chapters that deal with Penhurst, the institution. And I had to really be careful there because, when you're writing about a mental institution, it's so depressing. So I had to be careful there to really push my focus into the friendship of these 2 youngsters and how they, like so many disabled kids, learn to communicate in ways that many of us might not necessarily have the patience or the wisdom to know how to do.
The name of the new novel is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. It is by James McBride. It is published by Riverhead. James, I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to have you on the program. This book is absolutely glorious, and I thank you so much for sharing with us.
My pleasure. Take
Be
care.
well. Thank you. James McBride's new novel is The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. It is published by Riverhead Books. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next